How do you build an empire without writing a single word? That is the paradox at the heart of this story. Some of the most complex economies in history, from ancient Mesopotamia to the vast Inca realm, thrived not on paper or parchment, but on invisible systems like knotted cords, split sticks, and clay tokens. These hidden methods managed trade, taxation, and debt across entire civilizations. By the end of this video, you will see how these forgotten technologies solved the timeless challenge of trust and accountability as cleverly as any modern computer. But here is the mystery. How could a broken stick or a sealed clay ball carry the weight of a major financial agreement? And why were these seemingly primitive tools trusted for centuries across so many different cultures? When you think of ancient economies, do you picture success without paper? The key is understanding what invisible record-keeping truly meant. These were systems hidden in plain sight. They used materials that rot or fade, symbols that were memorized not written, and objects that locked information inside until the right moment. For example, a clay envelope might hold tokens that only the recipient could count. A tally stick split in two would only reveal its meaning when both pieces were reunited. To a historian looking only for written texts, these artifacts seemed empty or broken. But to the people who used them, they were as reliable as any ledger. Invisibility was not a weakness, it was a feature. It made them portable for trade and understandable to everyone in the community regardless of literacy. This was record-keeping woven into life itself, carried in memory and handled by touch, and that is precisely why it survived where written records could not. The need for accountability was as old as trade itself. From the muddy banks of the Tigris to the high peaks of the Andes, every early economy faced the same problem. How do you keep track of who gave what, who owes what, and who has the right to take grain from the communal storehouse? Trade, taxation, grain storage, and debt all demanded reliable methods to record obligations and exchanges. But literacy was rare, often limited to a tiny class of scribes or priests. The vast majority of people could neither read nor write, so these societies did something ingenious. They developed memory tools that were durable, portable, and verifiable without ever touching a written word. This is where the idea of external symbolic storage comes in. Instead of relying on human memory, which is fallible and fades, people used physical objects to offload the burden of remembering. A clay token sealed inside a hollow ball represented a specific number of sheep. A knotted cord carried the details of a tax payment across the empire. A split stick, when reunited, proved a debt had been settled. These objects became the external hard drives of their day. They allowed an economy to scale far beyond what any single human mind could track. Now the community could trade with strangers, store grain for seasons ahead, and manage debts that spanned years. The invisible system was born not from mystery but from practical necessity, and its power lay in its universal language of touch and trust. The earliest invisible record keepers were no bigger than a fingertip. In the ancient Near East, around 8,000 years before the Common Era, people began shaping small pieces of clay into simple geometric forms: a cone, a sphere, a disc. Each shape carried a specific meaning. A cone might represent a measure of oil, a sphere stood for a bushel of grain, a flat disc could mean a sheep. These were the very first tokens in a system that would last for thousands of years. When two traders completed a transaction, they would hand over the corresponding tokens as proof of the exchange. But the tokens themselves were easy to lose, easy to tamper with. So someone had a brilliant idea. They took a handful of tokens, placed them inside a hollow ball of clay, and sealed it shut. This clay envelope, called a bullae, locked the tokens inside. Now the record was secure, No one could change the number or type of tokens without breaking the seal. But there was one problem. Once the envelope was sealed, the information inside became invisible. How would anyone know what the envelope contained without smashing it open? The solution was as clever as it was simple. Before the clay dried, the sender pressed each token into the surface of the envelope, leaving a clear impression. Now the outside of the bulla showed exactly what was hidden inside. A row of cone-shaped impressions meant 5 measures of oil. A circle of sphere-shaped impressions meant 10 bushels of grain. The envelope could be stored, transported, or handed over to a third party, and the code remained readable on the surface. But the true genius of this system was that it blurred the line between record and object. The impressions were not just symbols, they were direct imprints of the reality they represented. Over centuries, this practice evolved. People realized they no longer needed the physical tokens inside the envelope. The impressions on the outside were enough. They began to scratch those same shapes directly onto flat clay tablets. The cone became a wedge-shaped mark. The sphere became a circular stamp, and from these tiny, repeated impressions, the first true writing system of the ancient world was born. Cuneiform, the script of Sumer, emerged directly from the invisible record-keeping of clay tokens. So the next time you think of writing as a leap forward, remember that its roots lie in a simple clay ball that kept its secrets safe. That clay ball was more than just a container. It was a locked box for information, a silent guardian of a deal. Think of it this way: if you and I made a trade and I handed you a sealed envelope, you would have my word that the contents matched the marks on the outside. But what if I had put fewer tokens inside than I claimed? You would never know until you broke the seal, and by then the trust would be gone. The cleverness of the clay envelope lay in its double layer of proof. On the outside, the pressed impressions told a story that anyone could read at a glance. 5 cone shapes meant 5 measures of oil. 10 discs meant 10 sheep. That visible summary let the parties verify the gist of the agreement without ever touching the tokens inside. But the real treasure was hidden. The actual tokens, each one a tiny physical record of a specific quantity or commodity, remained sealed inside the clay. They were invisible, untouchable, and impossible to alter without leaving clear evidence. This dual system gave the economy something precious: secrecy combined with verification. You could show the summary to a third party, a witness or a tax collector, without exposing the full details. And you could keep the tokens safe from tampering because the only way to change them was to break the envelope, which would shatter the seal and destroy the evidence. In a world where trust was everything, this was a revolutionary invention. It meant that 2 strangers could make a deal, store the record for years, and later reunite to break the seal and confirm the contents. The envelope became a trusted third party made of clay, but there was another layer of genius here. The marks on the outside were not just a decoration. They were the ancestors of writing itself. Over time, people realized they did not need the tokens at all. The impressions alone could carry the full meaning. So they began to flatten the clay into tablets and scratch the same shapes directly onto the surface. The envelope gave birth to the tablet, and the invisible record became visible. Yet the original idea, the hidden token sealed inside, never fully disappeared. It echoed through later systems. A split tally stick, for example, worked on the same principle. 2 parties each kept 1 half, and only when the 2 halves were matched could the full record be read. The information was split, invisible to anyone holding only 1 piece. This layered approach, part visible, part hidden, became a security feature that would reappear in medieval tally sticks, in sealed ledgers, and even in early forms of double-entry bookkeeping. So the clay envelope was not just a primitive tool. It was a blueprint for how to keep a record safe from fraud while still making it readable to those who needed to trust it. And it worked so well that the basic principle of sealing information inside a container with a visible summary on the outside survives today in everything from tamper-proof packaging to encrypted digital files. The invisible record keepers of the ancient world understood something that still holds true. Sometimes the best way to protect a truth is to hide it in plain sight, with just enough clues on the surface to earn trust, and the full story locked safely inside. Wood replaced clay in another ingenious invisible system. Across Europe and Asia, from ancient Rome to medieval China, people turned to a simple split stick to keep their most important records. A tally stick was nothing more than a straight piece of wood, often hazel or willow, about the length of a forearm. The person recording the transaction would cut notches into one edge, each notch representing a specific amount. A deep notch might mean 10 coins, a shallow one a single coin. The pattern of notches told the whole story of the debt or payment. Then came the clever part. The stick was split lengthwise, carefully down the middle, so that the notches were divided into two matching halves. One party took one half, the other party the opposite half. From that moment on, the record became invisible. Anyone holding just one piece would see only a set of partial notches, meaningless without its partner. The full proof existed only when the two halves were reunited. Only then did the notches line up perfectly, confirming the exact amount and the agreement. This system was nearly impossible to forge. A fraudster could not carve a new set of notches onto a single half because it would never match the other half. The wood itself would show signs of tampering, the grain disrupted, the surface uneven. And since both halves were kept separately, often by people who did not trust each other, the chance of collusion was tiny. The tally stick became a foolproof receipt. Two strangers could make a loan, split the stick, and walk away with absolute confidence that neither could cheat the other. If a dispute arose years later, they would bring their halves together. If the notches aligned, the debt was undeniable. If they did not, the claim was false. The uses of tally sticks spread far beyond simple loans. Tax collectors in medieval Europe carried bundles of them. When a peasant paid his grain tax, the collector would cut notches on a stick, split it, give one half to the peasant as proof, and keep the other for the treasury. The King's Exchequer, the royal financial office, held entire chests of these split sticks, each one a permanent record of revenue. In China, tally sticks were used for official transactions, military supplies, and even as a form of currency. A merchant might accept a tally half as payment, knowing that the other half was held by a reliable debtor. The stick itself became a tradable promise, a piece of wood that carried the weight of real value. In some regions, broken tally sticks were accepted in markets much like coins because the people trusted the system behind them. The genius of the tally stick was that it made the record physical and personal. The notches were not abstract symbols like numbers on a page. They were cuts in the wood, felt by the fingers, visible to any eye, and the act of splitting transformed a single object into two mutually dependent halves. The information was literally divided, hidden from anyone who held only one piece. This invisibility was not a flaw. It was the very source of the tally's power. It forced both parties to cooperate to reveal the truth. It turned a simple wooden stick into a guardian of trust that lasted centuries, and it worked so well that the British government continued to use tally sticks for official accounts until the early 19th century, long after paper ledgers had become common. The invisible record keepers of the ancient world did not fade away quietly. They held on, sometimes for thousands of years, because their logic was timeless. A split stick could do what a written contract could not. It could prove itself. The English Exchequer turned the tally stick into the backbone of a kingdom. For over 600 years, the royal treasury used notched wooden sticks to track every tax payment, every debt owed to the crown, and every expense of the state. But the Exchequer tallies were not simple receipts. They were a sophisticated financial instrument, a form of invisible money that circulated through the economy. The system worked like this: when a taxpayer, a sheriff, or a merchant paid his dues to the king, the exchequer officials would cut a series of notches into a fresh hazel stick. The depth and spacing of the notches indicated the exact amount: a deep notch for £1,000, a medium notch for 100, a shallow one for a shilling. The pattern was a secret language known only to the trained clerks. Then came the critical step. The stick was split lengthwise but with a serrated edge, a jagged line that ran through the notches. One half, called the stock, was kept by the exchequer. The other half, the counterfoil, was given to the taxpayer as proof of payment. The serrated split made the halves unique. No other stick could match them. If anyone tried to forge a counterfoil, the jagged edge would not align with the stock. The record was invisible to anyone holding only one piece. Only when the two halves were brought together, the notches interlocking perfectly, could the full amount be verified. This gave the tally an extraordinary power. The counterfoil itself became a tradable object. A merchant who had received a tally from the exchequer could use it to pay his own taxes, passing the stick along like currency. Since the exchequer accepted tallies as proof of payment, people began to trade them on a secondary market. A tally for £100 might change hands several times before it was finally presented to the treasury. It was an early form of paper money, but made of wood, not paper. The value was not printed. It was carved into the grain and locked into the split. This system allowed the English crown to borrow money on the promise of future tax revenue. A lender would receive a tally as a bond, a promise that the exchequer would repay the amount when the taxes came in. The tally became a symbol of trust in the state itself. For centuries, chests full of these split sticks filled the vaults of Westminster. They recorded the financial life of a nation. Kings came and went, wars were fought, tax rates changed, but the tallies remained, silent witnesses to every transaction. And then, in 1834, the government decided to modernize. The ancient tally system was obsolete. Paper ledgers and printed receipts had taken over. So the exchequer ordered the destruction of the old tallies, thousands upon thousands of them, stacked high in the furnaces of the Houses of Parliament. The burning sticks created a massive heat, a fire that accidentally ignited the wooden beams of the building. The Great Fire of 1834 consumed the old Palace of Westminster, reducing centuries of history to ash. The invisible record keepers, the very tools that had financed the English state for 600 years, finally revealed their secret in the most dramatic way possible. They burned down the very house that had built them. Across the ocean, another invisible system thrived in the Andes. The Inca Empire stretched over 2,000 miles from modern-day Colombia to Chile, linking mountain peaks, coastal deserts, and jungle valleys. It had no written language, no paper, no script, yet it managed one of the largest and most organized economies in the pre-Columbian world. The secret was a set of knotted cords called quipus. To an outsider, a quipu looked like a tangled mess of colored strings, a tassel of twisted fibers hanging from a central cord. But to the trained eye, every knot, every twist, every hue carried meaning. The system was invisible to those who did not know the code, and that was exactly the point. Each quipu consisted of a main cord, often thick and pliable, from which dozens of thinner pendant cords dangled. These pendants could be further divided into subsidiary cords, branching like a family tree. The knots themselves were tied at specific intervals along each cord. Their number, position, and type, whether a simple overhand knot or a more complex figure 8, represented numerals in a base 10 system. A single knot near the bottom of a cord might mean 1. A cluster of 5 knots higher up could mean 50. A space with no knots indicated a 0. The Inca recorded everything this way, census counts, the number of households in a village, the quantity of llamas in a herd, the amount of maize stored in a royal granary. A single quipu could hold thousands of data points, all encoded in cotton or camelid fibers, but numbers were only half the story. Colors added another layer. A red cord might represent the emperor or the military. A yellow cord could stand for gold or the sun deity. A white cord often meant peace or the common people. The direction in which a cord twisted, left or right, could indicate a category such as men versus women, or goods coming in versus goods going out. Even the way a cord was attached to the main cord, whether it hung straight or was looped, held significance. The quipu was a multidimensional data structure, a three-dimensional spreadsheet hanging from a string. The problem was that only a small class of specialists, the quipucamayocs, could read it. These were the trained record keepers of the empire. They studied for years, memorizing the conventions of color, knot placement, and chord hierarchy. They carried quipus in their hands, recited the information aloud, and passed their knowledge to apprentices. To an ordinary farmer or soldier, a quipu was as mysterious as a foreign language. But to the administrators of Cusco, it was the living memory of the realm. The Inca used quipus for far more than simple inventories. They recorded histories, genealogies, and even narratives. When the Spanish arrived, they were baffled. They demanded written records, but the Inca offered knotted cords. The conquerors dismissed them as primitive. They burned thousands of quipus, believing they were pagan tools or useless string. What they did not realize was that the quipus encoded the entire administrative and cultural identity of the Andes. Without them, the empire could not be governed. Tax collectors used quipus to track what each province owed. Census takers used them to count every household, every child, every llama. Generals used them to organize armies and supplies. The quipu was the invisible thread that held the Inca world together. And here is the haunting part. We have recovered hundreds of quipus from tombs and ruins, but we have lost the key to reading most of them. The quipucamayocs, the living interpreters, were wiped out by disease and violence in the decades after the conquest. Their knowledge vanished. We can see the knots, the colors, the chords. We know the numerical system, but the narrative layer, the stories and names encoded in the fibers, remains silent. A few quipus from the colonial period have been partially decoded with the help of Spanish documents, yet the vast majority are still invisible to us, locked in a code no one alive can break. They hang in museums like frozen conversations, waiting for a voice they will never hear again. The irony is that the very invisibility that made quipus a powerful administrative tool also made them vulnerable to erasure. When the keepers of the code disappeared, the system became a ghost, which raises a question that lingers long after the threads have faded. How many other invisible record keepers have we lost, not because they were broken, but because the meaning behind them was simply forgotten? That question about what else we have lost hangs over every quipu we study, but even in their silence, the chords reveal a system of astonishing complexity. Every element carried meaning, and that meaning was layered so that a single quipu could hold an entire dataset without a single written word. The colors were the first layer of code. A red cord might signal the military, a green one agriculture, a blue one water or the sky. Yellow could represent gold or the sun, white the common people or peace. These were not arbitrary choices. They came from a shared cultural palette, a set of associations taught to every quipucamayoc from childhood. When an administrator saw a group of red pendant cords, he knew instantly that he was looking at military records. If the same cords were interwoven with yellow, it might mean a military campaign that involved gold tribute. The colors acted as category headers, like tabs in a filing system, but woven directly into the thread. The knots added the numbers. Each knot was tied at a specific position along the cord, and the spacing between knots indicated place value in a base 10 system. A cluster of 3 knots near the end of a cord might mean 3, 5 knots higher up could mean 50, a single knot at the very top might mean 100. And a cord with no knots at all meant 0, a concept that the Inca understood long before many European mathematicians fully accepted it. The type of knot also mattered. A simple overhand knot could be a unit. A figure 8 knot might indicate 10. A long knot pulled tight could represent a larger number. Together, the knots formed a numerical language that could record census counts, storehouse inventories, and tax obligations with precision. But the true brilliance lay in the hierarchy of the cords. From the main cord, pendant cords hung down like branches from a trunk. Each pendant could have its own subsidiaries, smaller cords tied to it. This structure allowed the quipu to represent relationships. A main pendant might represent a village. Its subsidiaries could represent the households in that village. Their own tiny cords might list the number of people, llamas, and bags of potatoes in each household. The physical arrangement of the cords mirrored the organization of the society itself. It was a data tree, visible to the eye but invisible in meaning to anyone who had not learned the system, because here is the crucial point. The quipu was simultaneously visible and invisible. You could see the cords, the colors, the knots. You could even touch them, but the meaning behind them was locked inside a cultural code. Without training, a red cord was just a red cord. With training, it became a column of military strength. The system demanded years of cognitive investment. The quipucamayocs did not merely memorize numbers. They internalized an entire grammar of color, position, knot type, and chord hierarchy. They learned to read the quipu like we read a book, but in 3 dimensions across multiple chords at once. This was not a simple mnemonic device. It was a sophisticated external memory system, one that required the human mind to partner with the physical object. Recent research has added another layer to this story. For decades, scholars believed quipus contained only numerical data. But new studies, using high-resolution photography and digital analysis, have revealed patterns that suggest narrative information as well. Certain chord combinations appear to encode names, places, or events. Colors and knot sequences may have recorded stories, genealogies, and even laws. It seems the Inca used quipus as a kind of written language without letters, a system where meaning was embedded in the material itself. If this is true, then the loss of the quipucamayocs was not just the loss of accountants. It was the loss of an entire literature, a library woven in fiber. This cognitive investment, the decades of training, the shared cultural knowledge, was the price these societies paid for an invisible system. It was not a weakness, it was a trade-off. You could not simply pick up a quipu and read it like a modern ledger. But in exchange, the record was durable, tamper-resistant, and intimately tied to the community that created it. The meaning lived not in the cord alone, but in the minds of the people who tied and untied its secrets. And that is what makes every surviving quipu such a poignant artifact. We hold the physical object, but the invisible world it once contained remains just beyond our reach. A story we can almost touch but cannot quite unfold. Cowrie shells carried more than value, they carried memory. For thousands of years across the coasts of Africa, the islands of the Indian Ocean, and the trading networks of Asia, these small, glossy shells served as both money and record. A single shell meant little on its own, but a string of shells, counted, knotted, and stored in a standardized bundle, told a story. It recorded a debt, a payment, a gift, or a tax. The shells themselves became the ledger. There was no need for paper or ink. The record was embedded in the physical object, visible to anyone who understood the code of the string. The system worked because everyone agreed on the value of the cowrie. That agreement was not written down. It lived in the shared understanding of communities, passed from trader to trader, from village to village. A cowrie from the Maldives might be worth a certain amount of grain in Mali. and that same shell could be traded again in the markets of Bengal. The value was not stamped by a king or engraved on metal. It was cultural consensus built over generations of use, and that very consensus turned the shell into a trustworthy record. When a merchant handed over a string of cowries, the receiver did not need to count them twice. The length of the string, the number of shells per knot, the way they were threaded, all of that carried precise meaning. It was a message written in beads. Counting and stringing were acts of memory. A string of 100 shells might represent a debt of that amount. A bundle of 10 such strings could mean a loan of 1,000. The physical act of threading each shell, of grouping them by tens or twenties, forced the mind to pay attention. This was not abstract arithmetic. It was tactile, repetitive, and deliberate. The very process of creating the string served as a recall aid. Years later, when the same string was brought out, the owner could run his fingers along the shells and remember the transaction. The record was not locked in a clay envelope or split on a wooden stick. It was open, portable, and visible to anyone who knew the conventions. Yet it was still invisible in the sense that no written word ever touched it. The information lived in the object itself, in the number and arrangement of shells, and in the shared memory of the community. This system was decentralized. Cowries moved from hand to hand across entire continents without a central treasury or a royal scribe. A farmer in West Africa could accept shells from a trader from the coast, knowing they would be accepted by the next merchant in the interior. The same shells might later end up in a ceremonial necklace or a bride price, still carrying the traces of their journey. Because the record was distributed, it could not be burned in a single fire or erased by a conqueror. The invisible ledger was woven into the fabric of daily life. Every string of cowries was a fragment of the economy, a tiny database that anyone could read with their hands. And in a world where most people could not read at all, that made perfect sense. So the humble cowrie shell, small enough to hold in the palm, became a global language of value and memory. It outlasted empires, crossed oceans, and survived the arrival of coinage. The secret was not the shell itself, but the system of counting and stringing that turned it into a living record. The invisible record keepers of the ancient world were not always clay or wood. Sometimes they were something as simple as a shell, strung on a thread, carrying the weight of trust across a continent without ever saying a word. And that raises a question that lingers. What other everyday objects, still scattered in the soil or tucked in museum drawers, once held the same invisible power? Every invisible system leaned on a living memory. The clay envelopes, the split tallies, the knotted quipus, they were not standalone tools. They were props in a much larger performance, one that depended on human minds trained to interpret and recall. Across West Africa, the griot was that living memory. For centuries, these oral historians carried the entire weight of their communities within their voices. A griot could recite the genealogy of a village back dozens of generations, name every marriage, every debt, every treaty, and every dispute that had ever been settled. When a trade agreement was made, the details were not written down. They were sung, chanted, and memorized in the presence of witnesses. The physical object, a string of cowries, a carved staff, a clay token, was merely a trigger. It reminded the griot which story to tell, but the true record lived in the mind. The power of this system was its resilience. If the token was lost, the griot still remembered. If the griot died, the apprentice who had listened since childhood could pick up the thread. The knowledge was passed in person, from elder to student, in a chain that stretched unbroken for centuries. In the Pacific Islands, memory keepers played a similar role. On islands like Yap, the famous stone money, giant limestone discs, represented enormous wealth. But the actual record of who owned which stone was never carved into the stone itself. It was held in the memory of the community, passed down through oral tradition. People knew which family had contributed to the quarrying expedition, which stone had been broken during transport, and which disc had changed hands in a marriage agreement. The stone was just a symbol, the ledger was human. This combination of object and orator created a powerful redundancy. If the object broke, the story survived. If the storyteller fell silent, the object still held a clue for someone else to activate. The system was not fragile. It was built to endure loss. Think about a quipu in the Andes. Without a trained quipucamayoc, the knotted chords were just strings. But with the interpreter, every color, every knot, every twist became a sentence in the empire's census. The two halves relied on each other. The object stored the data in a durable form. The human stored the code to unlock it. Lose either one, and the information became invisible. This is why these societies invested so heavily in training. The Griots spent years learning not just stories, but the art of recall. They used mnemonic devices, rhythm, music, and repetition to lock details into long-term memory. The quipucamayocs studied for decades under a master. Even the simple act of splitting a tally stick required both parties to remember which notch meant which amount. The system was never purely mechanical, it was social. So when we marvel at the ingenuity of a clay envelope or a cowrie string, we must also remember the people who animated them. The invisible record keepers were not just objects, they were relationships, they were trust built between a token and a tongue. And that partnership, that delicate dance between a physical trigger and a trained mind, gave these ancient economies a resilience that written records sometimes lack. A fire could destroy a library of papyrus scrolls, but a griot's memory, protected by a community, could survive disaster. The invisible system was not a weakness. It was a network of human bonds woven as tightly as any quipu cord. And that raises a final question. What kind of memory are we building today when our records depend on screens and servers that can be wiped in an instant? Perhaps the ancient world still has something to teach us about the value of a story spoken aloud. Much of this ancient record-keeping has simply rotted away. The materials that carried the invisible systems, wood, string, cloth, and shells, are fragile. They decay quickly in most soils. Unlike stone monuments or fired clay tablets, a tally stick left in damp ground will turn to dust within a few decades. A quipu made of cotton or camelid fiber will rot if exposed to moisture for long. Cowrie shells may survive, but the threads that once strung them into meaningful patterns dissolve. The physical evidence vanishes, leaving behind almost nothing for archaeologists to find. That is why these systems were invisible for so long. Historians naturally focused on what survived. They studied the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, the papyrus scrolls of Egypt, the stone inscriptions of Rome. Those written sources were abundant, durable, and easy to interpret. But the unwritten record keepers, the split sticks, the knotted cords, the string of shells, were dismissed as primitive or simply overlooked. The bias was not malicious. It was practical. If you cannot see the evidence, you cannot study it. And so generations of scholars assumed that ancient economies must have relied entirely on writing, that anything else was too crude to manage complex trade or taxation. But that assumption is crumbling. Recent archaeological discoveries have begun to pull the invisible back into view. In the peat bogs of northern Europe, where waterlogged conditions slow decay, perfectly preserved tally sticks have been found. Some date back over 2,000 years. Their notches are still sharp. Their split halves still fit together like a puzzle. These finds show that wooden record-keeping was widespread, far beyond what historians once believed. In the dry deserts of coastal Peru, where the air is arid and stable, quipus have survived for centuries inside burial sites and storage rooms. The cords are brittle but intact. The knots remain tight. Researchers can now photograph them under high magnification, revealing details that were lost to earlier observers. Color patterns that faded to gray in damp museums still blaze brightly in these desert caches. And in West Africa, ethnographic studies of living Griot traditions have shown how oral memory can hold vast ledgers of debt and genealogy without a single written word. These are not relics of a primitive past. They are living systems that continued into the colonial period and, in some places, persist today. Together, these discoveries force a major shift in perspective. The ancient world was not a place where only the literate few kept records. It was a landscape rich with invisible systems, robust, sophisticated, and tuned to the materials and cultures that created them. Every tally stick found in a bog, every quipu rescued from a dry cave, every cowrie string traced through oral tradition is a reminder that our written archives are incomplete. They capture only a fraction of the economic life that once hummed across the globe. The rest is hidden in decay, in the gaps of the archaeological record, and in the silence of knowledge that was never written down. And that raises a haunting possibility. How many other systems have we lost entirely, not because they were weak, but because their very strength, their reliance on perishable materials and living memory, made them invisible to the eyes of later generations? What made these systems so resilient was a set of advantages written records often lacked. Security came first. A clay envelope sealed with tokens could only be opened by the intended recipient. A split tally stick meant nothing to anyone holding just one half. The information was hidden from prying eyes, safe from forgery, and verifiable only by those with the matching piece. This built-in security meant that trust did not depend on a central authority or a scribe. It was embedded in the object itself. Portability was another strength. A quipu could be rolled up and carried across mountain passes. A handful of clay tokens fit in a pouch. A tally stick tucked into a belt was easier to transport than a stack of papyrus scrolls. These records moved with people, not locked in a temple archive, and the cost was minimal. Clay was free for the taking. Wood could be cut from any forest. Cotton and camelid fiber came from local herds. Cowrie shells washed up on beaches. The materials were abundant, requiring no specialized trade networks or expensive imports. Any community could make its own record-keeping tools. Accessibility was perhaps the most democratic feature. No one needed to read or write to use a tally stick. A farmer could count notches with his fingers. A woman in the Andes could understand the color of a chord without knowing a single letter. These systems worked across social classes. A peasant and a king could both verify a transaction using the same physical method. That was revolutionary in a world where literacy was a privilege of the few. Durability added to their staying power. Clay tokens from 8,000 years ago still survive in museum collections today. Tally sticks preserved in dry or waterlogged conditions remain readable after centuries. Quipus from the Andes have lasted hundreds of years in desert tombs. Unlike paper, which rots or burns easily, these materials endure. They outlasted the civilizations that made them. Together, these advantages solved the core problem of any economy: trust. Without a central bank or a royal seal, people needed a way to prove that a debt was real, that a payment was made, that an agreement was honored. Invisible systems provided that proof in a form everyone could understand. They were adaptable to any environment, from the rainforests of Central America to the high plains of Africa. They did not require a state to enforce them. They worked because the logic was embedded in the physical world. So when we ask why these systems lasted so long, the answer lies not in their simplicity but in their elegance. They solved a universal problem with universal materials, and they did it without a single written word. The question that lingers is whether our own records, digital and centralized, will prove as resilient in the face of time. There was something deeply human about holding a broken stick that proved a promise. A written contract could be lost, burned, or disputed with a clever lawyer. But a tally stick split in two, with its jagged edges and matching notches, carried a weight that went beyond ink on paper. The very tangibility of the object made the debt or obligation feel real, even sacred. When a farmer handed over his half of a stick after paying his grain tax, he was not just receiving a receipt, he was holding a piece of the agreement itself. The physical object served as a constant reminder, a three-dimensional memory that could be touched, felt, and carried. This tactile connection changed the psychology of trust. A scribbled note could be dismissed as a forgery, but a wooden stick whose grain aligned perfectly with its partner felt undeniable. The invisible aspect added another layer of power. The tokens hidden inside a clay envelope, the knots on a quipu that only a trained interpreter could read, the matching halves of a tally, all of these created a sense of mystery. The record was partly hidden, partly revealed. That secrecy did not weaken trust, it strengthened it, because the proof came only when the correct pieces were brought together. The act of matching became a ritual. Two parties reunited their halves and the notches lined up. The seal was broken and the tokens inside matched the impressions on the surface. In that moment of physical confirmation, trust was renewed. The system worked because it engaged the human need for visible, tactile evidence. We trust what we can hold, what we can verify with our own hands and eyes. A written promise is abstract, a split stick is concrete. The very act of splitting a tally or sealing a clay envelope created a social bond. It was not just a transaction. It was a shared ritual. The two parties stood together, watched the wood split, witnessed the notches divide. They became co-creators of the record. That shared experience embedded the agreement in their memory far more deeply than a signature ever could. Over time, the tally stick became a symbol of the relationship itself, not just of the debt. If a dispute arose, the reuniting of halves was almost ceremonial. It forced both parties to face each other, to compare the physical evidence, and to resolve the conflict face to face. This social dimension is easy to overlook when we think of record-keeping as a cold, mechanical process. But for the people who used these systems, the object was alive with meaning. A quipu was not just a spreadsheet on strings. It was a map of a community, a woven history of obligations and alliances. A string of cowries was not just currency. It was a chain of trust that linked every person who had ever held it. By embedding the record in a physical object, these societies made the economy personal. Every debt had a face, every payment had a tangible proof, and the invisible code, the secret knots, the hidden tokens, the split halves, added a layer of protection that also deepened the sense of wonder. You could trust the system even if you did not fully understand it, because the proof was built into the world you could touch. That blend of mystery and certainty, of hidden knowledge and physical evidence, kept these systems alive for millennia. They solved not just an accounting problem but a human one. They turned trust into something you could hold in your hand. But no system is without its cracks. For all their elegance, these invisible record keepers carried real risks that could break the chain of trust. The most obvious flaw was the loss of a single piece. A tally stick split in half meant nothing without its partner. If a farmer lost his half of the stick, the entire record vanished into thin air. There was no copy, no duplicate, no paper backup. The debt or payment simply ceased to exist in any provable form. The same danger applied to the clay envelope. If the seal cracked in transit, or if the tokens inside were jumbled by accident, the whole record became suspect. Reconstructing the original agreement required both sides to be honest, and honesty was not always guaranteed. Forgery, though difficult, was not impossible. A clever person could carve false notches onto a tally stick, trying to match the pattern of the original half. But this was risky because the grain of the wood and the exact serrated split were hard to replicate perfectly. Still, the threat existed. In communities where trust was everything, even a single case of fraud could poison the entire system. People would begin to doubt the tally, the envelope, the quipu. And once doubt crept in, the invisible system lost its power. The complexity of what could be recorded was also limited. A tally stick could track numbers, but it could not capture the nuance of a contract, the conditions of a loan, or the identity of the parties involved beyond the split. A quipu could encode categories and quantities, but it struggled with abstract ideas or legal clauses. Writing, once it emerged, could do all of that. It could specify names, dates, and detailed terms in a form that did not require physical reunion. As trade expanded beyond face-to-face exchanges, these limitations became more severe. A merchant traveling from one city to another could not easily carry his half of a tally stick and expect the distant buyer to have the matching half. The system depended on the two parties being able to reunite their pieces at some point. That was fine for local debts or taxes paid within a village. But for long-distance trade across empires, the tally stick became impractical. Reconciliation required either the physical movement of the halves or a trusted messenger, both of which introduced delays and new opportunities for loss or fraud. The dependence on human memory and training was another vulnerability. The quipucamayocs, the griots, the tally clerks, all of them carried the code in their minds. If a specialist died suddenly, the knowledge could vanish with them. In the Andes, the Spanish conquest wiped out generations of trained interpreters, leaving the quipus silent. In West Africa, the death of a griot without an apprentice meant entire genealogies and debts were lost forever. The system was resilient only as long as the human chain remained unbroken. These flaws eventually pushed societies toward more visible and standardized forms of record-keeping. Written contracts on papyrus, parchment, or paper offered permanence and portability that the invisible systems could not match. A single document could be copied, witnessed, and stored in multiple locations. It could travel across continents without requiring a matching half. It could record names, dates, and detailed terms that a tally stick could never hold. Over centuries, the invisible methods faded into the background, replaced by the written word. But here is the thing: they did not fade because they were primitive. They faded because the scale of trade and administration outgrew their design. For the worlds they served, for the villages, the kingdoms, the empires that used them, the advantages of invisibility far outweighed the risks. It was only when those worlds grew larger, when strangers needed to trust each other across vast distances, that the cracks became too wide to ignore. And even then, the old systems lingered. The English Exchequer kept tally sticks for centuries after paper ledgers were common, because they still worked. The invisible record keepers did not fail. They were simply outgrown. The first writing systems did not appear from a sudden spark of genius. They grew directly out of the invisible record keepers that came before, like a sapling rising from a buried root. In ancient Mesopotamia, the clay envelope with its pressed tokens did not just store information. It slowly taught people a new way to think about symbols. The impressions on the outside of the envelope were already halfway to writing. They were marks that stood for something real, a measure of oil, a number of sheep. At first, the marks were just a summary, a quick reference for the tokens hidden inside. But over generations, people realized they could skip the tokens entirely. Why bother molding tiny clay shapes and sealing them in a hollow ball when the pressed marks on the surface told the whole story? So they began to flatten the clay into tablets and scratch the same shapes directly onto the surface. The wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform were born from the cones and spheres of the old token system. A simple cone became a wedge that meant 1. A circle became a circular impression that meant 10. The invisible code became visible, readable by anyone who learned the script, but the transition was not a clean break. The old methods did not vanish overnight. For centuries, scribes used both tokens and tablets, often in the same transaction. The tokens remained in use for verifying large deals, their physical presence carrying a trust that ink on clay could not fully replace. The invisible system lingered as a backup, a trusted friend, long after writing took over. A similar story unfolded in the Andes. When the Spanish arrived, they brought parchment and ink, and they demanded written records. But the Inca administrators did not abandon their quipus. Instead, they adapted. Colonial documents from the 16th century show quipus being used alongside Spanish ledgers. A local governor might present a quipu to a Spanish official as proof of tax collection, and the official would copy the numbers into his book. The two systems coexisted, one visible, one invisible, each with its own strengths. The quipus could encode details that the Spanish script could not capture, like the color-coded categories and the hierarchy of communities. For a time, the invisible chords held their ground. But as colonial rule tightened, the Spanish grew suspicious of any system they could not read themselves. They saw the quipus as pagan objects, tools of a conquered religion. They burned them, banned them, and forced the indigenous record keepers to switch to paper. The invisible system was suppressed, but not entirely erased. Some communities kept their quipus hidden, passing the knowledge in secret. A few even survive today, still tied and knotted, waiting for interpreters who may never come. In medieval Europe, the story was different. Tally sticks did not compete with parchment, they complemented it. A king's exchequer used both. Scribes wrote detailed accounts on rolls of sheepskin, listing every tax and payment in Latin. But when a peasant paid his dues, the official still cut a tally stick and split it. The written ledger was for the central archive, the big picture. The tally was for the individual, a portable, tamper-proof receipt that anyone could understand without reading. The two systems ran in parallel for centuries. The parchment held the summary, the tally held the proof. The invisible method thrived because it solved a problem that writing could not easily address: how to give a receipt that required no literacy and could not be forged. The transition was never a straight line from primitive to advanced. It was a slow, practical blending. Each new technology did not erase the old one. It squeezed it into a smaller niche, a specialized role where the old method still worked better. The clay token gave way to the tablet, but the idea of sealing a record inside a container never died. It echoes in every wax seal pressed onto a medieval charter, every lock on a modern safe. The knotted cord gave way to the ledger, but the principle of encoding information in color and position survives in barcodes and QR codes. The invisible record keepers did not fail. They evolved. They became the hidden scaffolding beneath the visible world of writing, still doing their quiet work, still keeping secrets, still proving trust in a way that no amount of ink could ever match. And that is why, even today, we still reach for something we can hold when a promise needs to be certain. On the Silk Road, a single piece of wood could decide the fate of a caravan worth more than a kingdom. The merchants who braved the deserts and mountain passes carried more than silks, spices, and gems. They carried sealed tokens and split tally sticks tucked inside their robes. These small, unassuming objects were the invisible records of agreements made months earlier, in markets thousands of miles apart. A trader from Kashgar might hand a clay token to a partner in Samarkand, and that token would travel the entire length of the route, its meaning locked inside until the two halves of a matching tally were reunited. This was the backbone of long-distance trade before paper contracts became common. The system worked because it solved a simple but brutal problem. How do you trust someone you may never see again? The invisibility of these records was their greatest weapon. A tally stick split in half meant that no single person could alter or forge the complete agreement. If a merchant lost his half, the debt vanished. If a thief stole one piece, the other remained worthless until matched. In a world where caravans were vulnerable to bandits and dishonest officials, this built-in security was essential. A stolen half of a tally was just a useless splinter of wood. The real proof existed only in the reunion of the two pieces, and that reunion could happen months later in a distant city. The risk of fraud was turned into a logistical puzzle instead of a legal one. You could not bribe or argue your way out of a missing notch. The wood itself would betray you. The Hanseatic League, a powerful network of merchant guilds across northern Europe, built an entire system of credit on these same principles. A trader in Lubeck could issue a tally stick to a buyer in Bruges, splitting the stick and keeping one half. The other half would be passed from hand to hand, used to settle debts, buy goods, and even pay taxes in other Hanseatic cities. The tally became a form of currency, but one that was worthless unless you could match it with the correct counterpart. Merchants could transfer credit across the Baltic and the North Sea without carrying heavy bags of coins or writing lengthy contracts. They simply moved the wooden piece. The matching half stayed safe in the lender's strongbox, a silent guardian of the debt. When the final holder of the tally returned to Lubeck, the two halves would be brought together. If the notches aligned, the debt was honored. The system was so trusted that whole trade seasons passed with nothing more than a pile of split sticks to balance the books. This invisible method was not a crude substitute for writing. It was a deliberate choice crafted to meet the dangers of the road. A written contract could be stolen, altered, or lost. It required literacy, which was scarce among traders who spoke different languages. In contrast, a tally stick was universally readable. Anyone could count notches with their fingers. The colors or shapes of tokens could be agreed upon by all parties before a journey began. And because the record was physically split, it forced both sides to cooperate in revealing the truth. That cooperative act, the moment of matching, built a bond of trust that no parchment could match. A merchant who successfully redeemed a tally in a foreign land had proven not just the debt but his own reliability. The story of that successful match would spread through the marketplace, strengthening his reputation. The Silk Road and the Hanseatic trade routes were not worlds apart. They shared the same hidden logic. The best record is the one that remains invisible until the right moment. A clay token sealed in a pouch, a wooden stick with matching notches, a knotted cord carried across mountains. These objects did not shout their meaning. They whispered it only to those who held the missing piece. That secrecy was not a flaw. It was the very reason these systems could operate across continents without a central bank or a shared language. Fraud was common, but the invisible record keepers turned fraud into a nearly impossible game. To cheat the system, you would need to find the exact matching half of a stick you had never seen, or replicate a token whose shape and seal you could only guess at. The odds were stacked against the dishonest, and so the invisible records held the Silk Road together, strand by strand, notch by notch for centuries. Paper and ink did what wood and string could not. They carried meaning across continents without needing a matching half. As the centuries turned, the old invisible systems began to fade, squeezed out by technologies that promised more speed, more clarity, and more control. The rise of mass-produced paper, the spread of literacy beyond the clergy and scribes, and the growth of centralized state banks all worked together to make written records the new standard. A ledger could be copied 100 times. A contract could be signed by witnesses and stored in a vault. A debt could be recorded in a single document that both parties could read and verify without ever needing to reunite a split stick. The invisible systems had solved the problem of trust in a world of scarce writing. But once writing became cheap and common, their advantages evaporated. They were not broken, they were simply outcompeted. The most dramatic end came in England, where the Exchequer had relied on tally sticks for 600 years. In 1826, Parliament finally voted to phase them out. The wooden sticks were replaced by paper receipts and printed ledgers. Thousands of tallies, the silent backbone of the royal treasury, were declared obsolete. But what to do with them? For years, they were left to gather dust in the vaults of Westminster. Then, in 1834, an order came down to burn them. The furnaces beneath the Houses of Parliament were lit. The old sticks, dry as tinder, were tossed in. The heat was intense, far greater than anyone expected. The flames leaped from the furnace, caught the wooden beams of the building, and within hours the old palace of Westminster was ablaze. The fire raged for 2 days. The majestic hall where kings had been crowned, where laws had been debated for centuries, collapsed into ash and rubble. The invisible record keepers, the very tools that had financed the English crown since the Middle Ages, had their final revenge. They burned the house down. The irony was harsh and complete. The system that had held the kingdom's accounts together for so many generations destroyed the very building where those accounts were kept. After the fire, a new palace of Westminster rose from the ruins, the one we see today, complete with its famous clock tower. But the tally sticks were gone forever. Their story ended not with a quiet retirement but with a spectacular, accidental conflagration. Across the Atlantic, the end of another invisible system was quieter but no less final. In the Andes, the Spanish colonial authorities saw the quipus as a threat. They could not read them, they could not control them, and they suspected that the knotted cords carried secret information, coded messages that might incite rebellion or preserve pagan beliefs. So they banned them. In 1583, the Third Council of Lima ordered the destruction of all quipus that pertained to religious or historical matters. Thousands were burned. The quipucamayocs, the trained interpreters, were forced to abandon their art. Some hid their cords in remote caves or tombs. Others turned to the new system of written Spanish records. But the living chain of knowledge was broken. The Griots of West Africa faced a similar pressure. Colonial powers discouraged oral traditions, seeing them as unreliable or primitive. Missionaries and administrators promoted literacy and written records. The old songs and genealogies were still passed down, but they lost their official role. They became folklore instead of law. The invisible record keepers did not vanish all at once. They retreated into the margins. The cowrie strings were replaced by coins and paper money. The split tally sticks were replaced by printed receipts. The climactic moment came when centralized governments, with their banks, their tax offices, and their legal systems, took over the trust that had once been carried in a wooden notch or a knotted cord. The state became the ultimate record keeper, and the old objects, the humble clay tokens, the split hazel sticks, the colorful quipus, became curiosities, museum pieces, relics of a world that no longer needed their silent proofs. What remains is a lesson hidden in their ashes and threads. The systems we replace are not always inferior. They were simply built for a different world. And when that world changed, they could not change with it. The invisible record keepers did not fail. They were outgrown, and their disappearance in fire and silence marks the moment when trust moved from the palm of the hand to the page of a book. 1,000 years later, the same problem haunts every digital payment you make. When you send money online, you are trusting a bank or a payment company to verify that the transaction is real. You cannot see the proof, you cannot hold it. The record exists somewhere on a server, invisible to your eyes, protected by passwords and encryption. And yet, the core challenge is exactly the same one that faced a Sumerian trader or an Inca tax collector. How do you prove that a transaction happened without a central authority you both trust? How do you make sure no one can fake the record? The answer today looks nothing like a clay token or a split stick, but the logic is shockingly familiar. Think about the technology called blockchain, the invisible backbone of digital currencies like Bitcoin. At its heart, blockchain is a distributed ledger. Instead of one bank or government keeping the master copy, every participant in the network holds a copy of the entire transaction history. No single person can alter it because everyone else would immediately see the mismatch. That is distributed trust, the same principle that made a split tally stick so secure. With a tally, the information was divided between two parties. Neither could change their half without the other noticing. Blockchain does the same thing, but across thousands of computers instead of two people. The matching halves of a tally stick become digital signatures. When you send a Bitcoin, you sign the transaction with a private key, a secret code known only to you. The network verifies your signature using a public key that everyone can see. If the two keys match, the transaction is confirmed. If they do not, it is rejected. This is cryptographic proof, the digital evolution of matching notches on a piece of wood. And just like a clay envelope sealed with pressed tokens, the blockchain record is extremely hard to forge. Forging a single block would require rewriting the entire history of the chain, which would demand more computing power than any single attacker could muster. Forging a tally stick, meanwhile, required matching the exact grain and the serrated split of a piece of wood. Both systems made fraud so difficult that it became nearly impossible. The invisible record keepers of the ancient world were not primitive versions of our modern tools. They were early solutions to an eternal problem. How do you create trust between strangers who may never meet face to face? How do you ensure that a promise made today can be verified tomorrow, next year, or a century later without relying on a central authority that might be corrupt or collapse? The clay envelope, the split stick, the knotted quipu, each answered that question using the materials and knowledge of their time, and they worked so well that they lasted for centuries. Now we have digital ledgers and cryptographic keys, but the underlying mechanism is the same. We are still splitting trust into matching halves. We are still sealing information in containers that resist tampering. We are still distributing the record so no single point of failure can destroy it. Studying these ancient invisible systems is not just a historical curiosity. It can inform how we design the next generation of digital records. The ancient world understood something that modern engineers are only rediscovering. The most resilient systems are the ones that make trust physical, distributed, and verifiable without relying on a single gatekeeper. The clay envelope and the blockchain are separated by thousands of years and vastly different materials. But they share a secret. Both hide the full truth until the right pieces come together, and both make cheating so hard that most people do not even try. So the next time you make a digital payment, remember that you are participating in a tradition that stretches back to the first sealed clay ball. The invisible record keepers never really disappeared. They just traded wood for wires and tokens for code. The question is, what will the next invisible system look like, and how will it change the way we trust each other? These ancient methods force us to reconsider what we think of as advanced in economic history. For decades, the story went something like this. True civilization began with writing, with cities, with coinage. Without these tools, societies were assumed to be simple, small-scale, incapable of managing complexity. But the clay envelopes, the split sticks, the knotted cords, they tell a different story. They reveal that early communities had already solved the core problem of economic coordination using materials as humble as mud and fiber. They built information technologies that were sophisticated not in spite of their simplicity but because of it. A quipu could encode thousands of data points in a format that was lightweight, durable, and verifiable without a single written word. A tally stick could carry a binding agreement across continents, its proof locked in the physical grain of the wood. These were not primitive crutches for pre-literate minds. They were deliberate, well-engineered solutions to the challenges of trust and memory. The assumptions we carry about progress often blind us to the ingenuity of systems that left no paper trail. We tend to measure advancement by what survives in the archaeological record. Stone monuments, clay tablets, metal coins, but the invisible record keepers were designed to disappear. Their strength lay in perishable materials that blended back into the earth or in living memory that vanished with its keepers. That does not make them less advanced. It makes them harder to see. When we look closely, we find that these societies developed distributed trust systems, cryptographic-style proofs, and portable ledgers long before the first bank or government mint. They understood that the most resilient record is the one no single person can alter alone. They understood that trust must be embedded in objects and relationships, not just in words. This is a corrective to a narrative that equates economic complexity with literacy and centralized authority. The Inca managed a vast empire without a written language. The Hanseatic merchants moved fortunes with split sticks. West African traders built continent-spanning networks on cowrie strings and sung genealogies. All of these systems worked because they matched the materials and skills of their communities. They were advanced for their context, and they were effective. So perhaps the question is not whether an economy is primitive without writing, but whether its record-keeping inspires enough trust to sustain trade, taxation, and debt across time and distance. By that measure, the invisible systems were not failures waiting to be replaced. They were successes that lasted centuries, and they remind us that every age invents its own forms of hidden trust, using whatever tools are at hand. The clay envelope, the split stick, the quipu, they are all chapters in a longer story about how humans solve the problem of memory. The next chapter is written in code, but the logic is ancient. The invisible record keepers are still teaching us if we know where to look. Every clay token and split stick was a deliberate choice, not a primitive accident. Across Mesopotamia, the Andes, Europe, and Africa, these invisible record keepers solved the same timeless riddle. How do you make a promise that cannot be broken? The answer was always the same. You split the proof into two halves. You hide the meaning inside a sealed container. You encode the information in a code that only the right people can read. From the Bullae with its pressed tokens to the tally stick with its matching notches, from the knotted quipu to the strung cowrie, the logic was identical. Trust was built into the object itself. No scribe, no king, no court was needed to verify a transaction. The physical world did the work. These systems were not temporary stepping stones on the way to real writing. They were fully formed technologies, honed over generations to fit the materials and needs of their cultures. A quipu could hold the census of an empire. A tally stick could represent a loan across a continent. A cowrie string could circulate as currency for centuries. They worked because they solved the problem of scalability. You could scale trade without scaling distrust. You could scale taxation without scaling bureaucracy. The invisible record keepers made it possible to build economies that spanned thousands of miles without a single written word. So now the question turns back to you. Which of these ancient systems captures your imagination the most? Is it the clay envelope that hid its secrets until the right moment? The split tally that forced both parties to cooperate? The quipu whose colorful chords still keep their stories locked away? Or the cowrie string that carried value and memory across oceans? Every one of them shows that human ingenuity does not require paper or screens. It only requires a problem and the courage to solve it with what is at hand. If you want to dig deeper, there are incredible resources out there about quipus and tally sticks. Books, museum collections, even digital reconstructions that let you explore these invisible records for yourself. The links are in the description below, and if you enjoyed this journey through the hidden history of trust, please take a moment to like this video. It helps more people discover these forgotten stories. Subscribe to the channel if you want to join me on the next exploration into the overlooked corners of the past. And drop a comment telling me which record-keeping system you find most fascinating. I read every single one. Until next time, keep asking questions, and remember that some of the most powerful truths are the ones we cannot see.